you ever wondered what the end of the great marshals and generals of the German army was like? What was the situation like when Hitler decided to dismiss them and get rid of them forever? Were they dismissed fairly? Next, in this program, we're going to analyze how the main marshals and generals of Germany fell during World War II. Following a chronological analysis, we will begin with the fall of Marshal von Manstein at the end of March 1944. As you all know, Manstein is considered by many to be the best general of World War II. He lived his glory years planning the invasion of Poland and France and his advance towards Leningrad as part of Army Group North during the summer of 1941. Later, his most notable action was the conquest of Crimea and the capture of Sevastopol during the summer of 1942, after which he was sent back to Leningrad. After the disaster at Stalingrad, he assumed the most important command he had ever had and had to coordinate both the rescue attack and the salvation of the entire German Army Group South during the first months of 1943. From here, he had his last great success during the Third Battle of Kharkov, after which all kinds of disasters followed. After failing to break through the Soviet defenses at Kursk, the Red Army went on a generalized offensive that was slowly pushing the Germans back to the Dnieper River. There, Manstein fought a great defensive battle until, by the end of March 1944, his relationship with the German leader had completely broken down. Continuous arguments and setbacks led Hitler to summon Manstein to his residence in the Alps on March 30th, 1944. There, he gave him the swords for his Knight's Cross and announced that he was going to be replaced by Walter Model on April 2nd. To justify the decision, Hitler told him that, although he agreed with the decisions that Manstein had made in recent months on the Eastern Front, the days of the great tacticians had passed, and that, from then on, he would need generals who could get the most out of their troops. Nevertheless, he gave him hope and made him understand that he would soon be called to a new command of troops. While on medical leave after undergoing cataract surgery on his right eye, he suffered an infection and was for a time in danger of losing his sight. On the day of the failed plot of the 20th of July, the attempt to assassinate Hitler, Manstein was at a seaside resort on the Baltic. Although he had met on several occasions with three of the main conspirators, including Stauffenberg, Manstein was not involved in the attempt. In October 1944, when it became clear that Hitler no longer intended to call him to a new post, he moved to an estate that the German authorities had granted him in eastern Pomerania, but he soon had to leave it because of the advance of the Soviet troops. In January, he presented himself in Berlin with the intention of being received by Hitler, but the German leader refused to do so. They never met again. Thus, one of the best German strategists was removed from active service during the last year of the war. Next on the list is von Kluge, who began the war in command of the German Fourth Army, playing a leading role in both Poland and France and during Operation Barbarossa. It was precisely when everything fell apart in front of Moscow in December 1941 that Kluge first took command of an army group, in this case, Army Group Center. He held this post for almost 2 years, during which his leading role was continually disputed with one of his subordinates named Walter Model, who commanded the Ninth Army. On the 27th of October 1943, Kluge was seriously injured when his vehicle overturned on the road from Minsk to Smolensk. He was unable to return to active service until July 1944, when he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, after Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed following the successful Allied landing in Normandy. He could do little to hold back the Allied advance for much longer in Normandy, and merely carried out Hitler's orders. After the failure of the counterattack at Avranches, during which he was cut off from communication, and suspicions that he was involved in the plot against Hitler on the 20th of July, Kluge committed suicide on his way to Berlin to meet Hitler. Next up is one of the most famous marshals of the war, Erwin Rommel. Rommel did not begin the war by leading a combat unit at the front. His main task during the Polish campaign was to secure the German leader. He then led the 7th Panzer Division during the Battle of France, becoming famous for his rapid advance through the Ardennes and later along the Atlantic coast. From there, he went to Africa in early 1941, where his exploits made him the most famous German general in the country and a real star for both the Germans and the British. However, it was also in North Africa where his luck changed after the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942. After Hitler's refusal to allow Rommel to retreat to the west, the relationship between the two cooled at times, and all the respect that had characterized them in the early years disappeared. Erwin Rommel was finally evacuated from Africa in February 1943, just a few weeks before the total collapse of the German forces in Tunisia. Thus, he returned to Germany completely worn out and depressed, losing many of the qualities that had characterized him. At the end of that year, he was sent to France to take charge of the defensive preparations to repel the imminent Allied invasion at some point on the Atlantic coast. There, his figure grew again, because the German media focused on his fame and skills as a general, selling him as a military man capable of anything. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and it became clear that Rommel would not be able to send them back to sea, the arguments between Hitler and Rommel began again. The last meeting between the two took place near Paris on June 17th. During this meeting, Rommel openly told Hitler that the best way out was to negotiate, to which the German leader responded evasively. As the situation in Normandy deteriorated by the day, on July 17th, Rommel was seriously injured by an Allied air attack while driving back to his headquarters. His serious injuries and the fact that his name was linked to the assassination attempt on Hitler 3 days later prevented him from leading troops in combat again. Although the evidence against Rommel was not entirely clear, Rommel was found guilty without being given the opportunity to defend himself. However, the German leaders knew that the German public would be horrified by a death sentence against Rommel, as the former Desert Fox was a national hero. So it was decided that everything to do with Rommel had to be done in secret and away from the public eye. Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, both loyal to Hitler, were sent from Hitler's headquarters to Rommel's home on the 14th of October 1944. On this visit, they gave Rommel 3 terrible options. Option 1 was to go with them to Berlin and defend himself before Hitler, who had already signed his death warrant. Option 2 was to be tried before the People's Court, with the condition that if he was found guilty, his entire family and some of his subordinates would be arrested and probably executed. And finally, the third option was to commit suicide himself. If he chose this option, he would be given a state funeral, and the official story would be that he succumbed to his wounds in Normandy. Furthermore, his family would not be harmed, and his reputation would remain intact. Rommel obviously chose the third option, which protected his family, and after telling them what was happening, he said goodbye to them and left with the 2 generals Hitler had sent to his home. A few minutes after leaving Rommel's residence, the driver stopped the vehicle. With the car stopped, both the driver and General Meisel got out of the car, leaving only Rommel and General Burgdorf in the back of the vehicle. Burgdorf then handed Rommel a vial of cyanide, which Rommel promptly swallowed. Once dead, the car drove to a nearby hospital where the marshal was certified dead. Hitler, after being informed of the event, declared a day of national mourning in Germany and a state funeral for Rommel in the city of Ulm. The 4th Marshal in our program is von Rundstedt. From the start of World War II, Rundstedt led army groups in both Poland and France, and later also during Operation Barbarossa, commanding Army Group South. It should be noted that he was already retired when the war began, but was called back to active service due to his extensive experience. His first major dismissal took place in early 1941 after having to leave the city of Rostov due to the strong Soviet counterattack. Although it seemed that he would not hold another military post, Hitler decided to name him Commander-in-Chief of the West a few months later. It was precisely in France where Rundstedt was assigned for the next 2 years, until he was again dismissed in early July 1944 after the successful Allied landing in Normandy. The reason for his dismissal was his defeatist attitude, in which he openly told Keitel that the war was lost and the only solution was peace. 2 months later, and against all odds, Rundstedt was called back to service and took charge of the Western Front again from the 1st of September 1944. In this position, he had to take charge of the defense of the Siegfried Line and later of the Rhine River, in addition to the offensive that the Germans launched again through the Ardennes in December 1944. He lost his last position of military responsibility on the 11th of March after the Allied crossing of the Remagen Bridge and was then appointed Chief of the Reserve. However, after suggesting again that the only thing to do was to sign a peace with the Allies, he was dismissed forever. Thus, when the Second World War came to an end a month and a half later, the German Marshal was already 70 years old. Next up is General Guderian. Like many of those we have named above, Guderian began the war with great unit commands, most notably during the French campaign and Operation Barbarossa. In Russia, he was primarily responsible for the direction of the 2nd Panzer Army, which was on the verge of reaching Moscow. However, due to the failure of the operation on the 25th of December 1941, and after a further argument with Kluge, he was relieved of command. In addition to Guderian, Generals Hübner, Brauchitsch, Rundstedt, and Bock were also relieved, along with another 30 generals. Falling out of favor during the following year, Guderian was again called into service in March 1943, when he was appointed Inspector General of Armored Forces. Guderian's new responsibilities included authority over tank production as well as the organization, doctrine, and training of the Panzerwaffe, including the panzer units attached to the Waffen-SS. Everything changed for him again after the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, when, due to the great loyalty shown to the German leader, helping to arrest traitors, Guderian was appointed Chief of the Army Staff on July 21st. He held this position until practically the last month of the war. During this period, he was key in all the desperate measures that the Third Reich applied to continue fighting, such as the creation of the Volkssturm. In any case, his main role was to reinforce the Eastern Front as much as possible to deal with the continuing Soviet threat. During the first months of 1945, and as the situation for Germany became more desperate, his discussions with Hitler became more intense. Finally, on March 28th, he had the most heated argument he had yet had with Hitler and was dismissed for good. The subject of the argument was the failed offensive to regain control of Kustrin. And finally, let's move on to the 6th Marshal we have on the program, Walter Model. This general was not famous, but well known during the early stages of the conflict, and it was not until late 1941 that his name reached Hitler's ears. The reason was the defensive determination Model showed in combat against the Red Army. Since he assumed command of the 9th Army, belonging to von Kluge's Army Group Center, in January 1942, Model was fighting all kinds of defensive battles in the Raze salient until he was finally evacuated before Operation Citadel. In this offensive against Kursk, Model led the attack of the German northern pincer. After the failure of the operation, Model continued to fight defensively until he was removed from command of the 9th Army at the end of 1943. It was not long before Hitler called him back, from which point on he would assume the command of large army groups. The first was Army Group North, which was retreating in the face of the Soviet offensive that managed to break the siege of Leningrad. He later replaced Manstein, and after Operation Bagration, he took charge of Army Group Center again, stopping the Soviets in Warsaw. From there, he went to the Western Front in an attempt to contain the situation in France. He never left that front again. His main position was that of commander of Army Group B, which he held from September 1944 until its end in April 1945. Although Model had served Hitler with unwavering loyalty throughout the war, the encirclement of his army in the Ruhr Basin caused their relationship to break down completely. In mid-April, Berlin accused Model of being a coward and a traitor, to which the German marshal replied that he felt deeply disappointed by those pigs who had as superiors. Finally, before surrendering, he chose to commit suicide on April 21, 1945. So, what do you think? What do you think was the most unjust dismissal of all? What position could Manstein have held during the final stage of the conflict? Leave me your opinion in the comments box. Greetings to everyone and see you next Sunday. See you soon.